So today is June 21st, and it's the first day of summer. And you know what that means? Football is coming. At least that's what it means for me. It's been a while for me. I've been kind of doing a sabbatical as far as going on air, but I'm pleased to be going back on air now. And I'm joined today by Connor Allen, who goes by I love the title, Sports Betting Manager at 4for4 Football. And you've been putting out content on a weekly basis, and we'll get into that a little later, but I encourage listeners to check out what you've been doing. So first of all, Connor, how are you?
I'm great. I appreciate you having me on, Ron. We're only, 40 some days away from the Hall of Fame game. The summer is flying by, and I think preparing for football season starts now. If you're not already preparing, I think you'll be behind by the time the season rolls around.
Absolutely, yeah. The preparation is year round, really. If you want to stay ahead of the game, stay ahead of the lines. Let's start with your background, though, in sports wagering. How did you get started? How did you get evolved into the NFL wagering circles?
Yeah, I started betting when I was really young, just on, anything, college basketball, NFL, basically everything. And I think it kind of just took my fandom to the next level of me thinking that I was able to project outcomes better than my friends or better than my peers. And I think that kind of snowballed into where I'm at today. And a lot of this, like the process was me trying to eventually make my own models in college, failing pretty miserably. And then, becoming and losing, frankly, a lot of money doing so, or at least what I consider to be a lot of money at the time. And then learning from those mistakes, trying to follow smart people and learn more from them. And then get to the point where I'm at now, which is, working for 4for4, as you mentioned, sports betting manager. I help on the business side as well, because we have a subscription product with tools and things for bettors to make them smarter, as well as, breaking down player props, sides and totals, basically everything every single week for our subscribers. So quite a big mix of everything there. But yeah, so it's took a while to get there, but it's been a fun ride.
I think it's an important point that you just learn by going in and you learn what works and what doesn't. And each person is different. People have different strengths. For example, I do not delve too much into NFL totals. I know people who are sharp in that area, but if it's not an area of expertise for me, I'd rather find out, hone in on what I do well. And it's trial and error. So I appreciate you sharing that. It takes a few years really to hone in and to get to where you need to go. Well, the 2022 season is over, and I have to admit it was a fantastic season on a number of levels. But we don't want to dwell too much about that. But there is a way that you want to start by what the lessons were learned from 2022 and carry them over into 2023. That's how I did it in February with my podcast Exit Report, 15, 20 minutes on each team, some with guests, some on my own, just to put a wrap on it, what I did well, what I didn't catch, and so on and so forth. And I've written a lot of articles since then and done a lot of behind the scenes work. I assume you've done the same. What lessons did you learn from 2022, and more specifically, how are you applying those to your work for 2023?
Yeah, I think it's a really important part of everyone's process, or at least it should be. And kind of like taking a step back after the season. Some people need a little bit longer than others. I needed like a week or so kind of to take a step back, then reflect on the 2022 season, whether it was in terms of where my handicaps were right, where they were wrong, what I was missing. And so specifically, look, like for me, I think a great example early on in the season specifically would be a team like the Indianapolis Colts, where I was pretty excited about them going into the season. I thought that Matt Ryan was a significant upgrade. Turns out that was completely wrong. And I think that a lot of my sharp friends, after that week one game, when they tied the Texans 2020, they were losing 20-6 entering the fourth quarter. They were betting the Jaguars to win the division at that point. Obviously, the Colts wound up losing and getting blanked by the Jags in that week two game. And that ended up proving right. And the Jags were able to win the division. But it's one of those things where, like, not moving off my priors fast enough, I think, is pretty important when you see something where I expected an immediate, increase in production without Carson Wentz, with Matt Ryan under the behind center, but we didn't see that. And that was something that I should have been a red flag pretty immediately. So I think looking out for those early in the season is very important for my process. And then specifically game planning into this following year, something that I'm really looking for specifically is more on the defensive side. So personally, my handicapping style relates a lot about matchups and exploiting those on specific sides of the ball. And so understanding more about defensive scheming, personnel, the impact of specific coaches in that frame, I think is really, really important. And I'm just continuing to learn on that aspect of a great example this year. Vic Fangio becoming the Dolphins defense coordinator, I think is going to make the defense do a 180 in terms of basically everything that they run, whether it's man coverage, blitz rate compared to what they're doing previously under Josh Boyer. So things like that. I know it was a long-winded explanation there, but yeah, I think that's where I'm headed in terms of finishing up 2022, heading up into 2023.
Yeah, it's people have different time periods as to when they get off their futures and their predictions and so on. So for me, I don't like to overreact to week one, but when week 4 is done, I don't care what I wrote in the preseason. It's what's happening in 2022, or in this case, what's happening in 2023 that matters. What were my expectations? Is there a time period where you forget all? I mean, it's hard sometimes, human nature. This team's always been good. New England's always been good at special teams. This team's always got off to a quick start, that kind of thing. The Giants got off to a quick start and they hadn't in the past. At what point do you just say, forget the previous year? I'm on to this year only, tunnel vision.
Yeah, I would say I think you're right in that 3 to 4 week range right there specifically. I mean, for us, I usually like to use a lot of data in my analysis in addition to what I'm seeing, what I'm watching, and like kind of my priors as well. So in the first few weeks, kind of that blend of analysis of what we've seen in a week or two plus our priors, I think is kind of a difficult blend. But like you said, after week 3 or 4, I feel pretty confident about a good chunk of the data that we've seen so far. Now, that being said, I think it's important to understand like the schedule and like who they have played. The Carolina Panthers a couple of years ago started super hot with Sam Darnold under center, I believe it was, and they were playing awesome. And I think I had pretty high expectations as well for them after they hired the LSU offensive coordinator to come in. Like they were all excited, and then the rest of the season was a complete disaster. It turns out the schedule they played was a complete joke. So I think contextualizing everything is really important. But generally, to answer your question, I would say that 3 to 4 week range is when I start to move off my priors significantly.
Okay. So in terms of your game plan, you mentioned that, yes, you say you've been working on it, you're starting to work on it, but you haven't been starting to work on it. Based on your podcast, you've been working on it, for 3 months or something like that. Did you have a game plan coming into how you wanted to attack this season, like where you wanted to be by July 1st, where you wanted to be by August 1st, or you just kind of roll with the punches and how did you approach this off season that way?
Yeah, so I think I take it piece by piece here. So it's, obviously we have free agency. I keep track of all the moves that way. NFL draft comes right after that. And then we're kind of in this lull right now. And in this time period, there's win totals are out, obviously pretty widely available across the board. And so at this point, I try and like pinpoint, or I guess in the past month, which you've seen in their content, you try and pinpoint the outliers of, okay, I think that this win total is significantly off of where we're at. And that's just without like doing a deep dive on every team. And so, like there's a couple usually that stand out, and then I do more research on them and I'm either confirmed or not confirmed. And I'm like, okay, I need to back off this take, or I think I should go harder on this. So that's kind of just my preliminary, thoughts off the top based on offseason moves. Then throughout the rest of the offseason, we do like a division by division thing where we go team by team, break down all of them in depth. And that helps lead me to kind of like another layer of bets that I might have missed on my initial take, or missed, a couple of offensive line moves here where they're don't have any continuity, or they have guys who aren't projected to be good, which could massively impact the offense. Things like that, maybe you don't catch on the first like run of free agency in the draft. So that's kind of my general game planning there. And then, as I mentioned, specifically focusing on more defensive stuff going into next year is going to be a pretty big key of mine.
Yeah, so I agree with that. And this kind of weird statement that I would make. This is the networking time for me, such as having you on, such as my weekly conversations behind the scenes with Las Vegas Chris, and any other content I get. But after the schedule comes out, and I've done all my articles, I'd say by May 25th, I'm ready for the NFL. It's really weird because nothing significant happens. Yeah, there's going to be I'm interested in where some of the edge rushers are going to sign, but that takes 5 minutes to really incorporate. Okay, so and so gets signed by San Francisco or Houston or wherever, then I incorporate that into my feelings about their defensive line. But from May 25th to August 15th until preseason actually starts, I have no new data. I have everything that I need if I've done my homework already, and it's really just the networking. So it's kind of interesting watching people catch up when they get going and read about it in August. A lot of the win totals and a lot of the numbers have already changed.
Yeah, no, it's definitely fair. Do you factor in any, so obviously training camp, all those things like preseason, like how much do you factor that into anything? If you see, I don't know, based on what you see, what you hear, any of that, does any of that matter to you at all?
It used to matter, believe it or not, a lot, especially when they had 4 preseason games. I used to write an article, Does the Preseason Mean Anything? And for probably 25 out of 32 teams, it did. But now with the 3 games and teams like the Rams basically avoiding preseason like the plague, you can't get anything out of that. However, for instance, Buffalo played the Rams last year. Buffalo did not rest their starters. The Rams, Stafford had a procedure in the off season. You can learn things. You can dig into the fact that the Rams weren't going to be ready week 1 and Buffalo was going to be ready week 1. But new coaches in particular, I study the preseason very carefully because I want to know what their schemes are. If Mike Tomlin tells me that he's going to ramp up the sack pressure, I believe him because he's a straight shooter. And I watch the August numbers for Mike Tomlin. If he tells me he's going to play more press defense, then I'm going to look to see how successful that was. So on a team by team basis, it's not going to be 25 or 26 out of 32 teams, but maybe about half the teams I'll get some nuggets in the preseason that'll help me.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that I mostly pay attention to, I guess, like usage notes with the first team. Cause like you said, most teams are like not even playing their starters, things like that. I think actual performance like just doesn't really matter a whole lot in the preseason. But in terms of, what players are starting with the first team, what players aren't. I mean, you can get a better, look at J.K. Dobbins, like wasn't going to be ready for the season. Now, how much does that
Yeah.
actually matter for, on a win perspective? Pretty marginal, if anything.
Yeah.
But in terms of like a usage perspective, I thought it was, noteworthy to say the least. If the Ravens are going to try and go super run heavy with, Gus Edwards and kind of a bunch of bottom tier backs, it might not have quite the same impact overall. So definitely that's super interesting for sure.
Yeah, example, Jimmy Ward missed the first 4 weeks. I think it was suspension or injury. I don't remember what, for San Francisco prior to 2022. So I was interested to see how the secondary was playing, even in meaningless games. Those guys were trying hard because somebody wanted to fill the void and earn a higher paycheck. Players play hard when they're called upon to play in preseason. And if I didn't see what I wanted to see, I thought San Francisco might start a little slow. So just some little things there, who's next man up, because you need to know the full roster, 17-game schedule. It takes more than your starters to get through an entire season. Ask the Chargers, ask Baltimore every single year, ask the 49ers every single year. Injuries are a fact of life, and what you think is going to happen in August doesn't always happen all the way through. Down at the bottom, I put a scroll, data that matters. And in college, I look at different things than in the NFL. For example, turnover data matters to me to a certain extent. Sack data matters to me to a certain extent. What data, if anything, matters to you more than some, maybe more than most?
Yeah, I like a lot of the, advanced metrics that are out there, but I think it's really important to understand that all of them have context and like just blindly throwing them out is really not useful. So I think stats like DVOA, EPA, success rate are all on some level useful, but they're generally descriptive stats and, like meaning that they describe what already happened and don't necessarily predict the future. But in some instances, like success rate, it's success rate is just how consistent a team has been at setting themselves up to score. So like understanding what that means, it's a binary yes, no on every single play. were they helping their team score, which there's a formula for, or were they not helping their team score? And that, like, overall, I think can give a good picture. Whereas like EPA incorporates touchdowns at certain points, and DVOA weights their schedule and things like that. So I think understanding the metrics and like what you're trying to say with them is super important. Now, I think all of them have a little bit of use, but like kind of using a blend of them together can help create a great picture of what
Right.
you're trying to understand and what you think can be actionable moving forward, given the way that I handicap, which is again mostly matchup based of how a certain team plays, what they're good at, and how that's going to match up against another team.
That makes sense to me. It's really a combination. It's really the big picture thing and not one particular stat. You can find some hidden gems, I think, in certain areas, but you have to know that the other team has a type of offensive scheme that's going to exploit that. I mean, if somebody's really, really good at rushing the passer, and you're playing against a team that has a weak offensive line, that's obviously they're going to have to commit more people to defend that, and it changes the dynamics of what they want to run on offense. So looking at it matchup based, I think is wise.
Yeah, like the Dolphins last year, again, the Dolphins against the Bills are such an interesting example because they just played like man coverage and just like blitzed Josh Allen basically as much as possible and forced him to just throw the ball to like Gabe Davis and Diggs like deep as much as possible. And it just created a lot of inconsistencies for him. But understanding that they do that, even though their metrics were average, or so, maybe they're more effective or less effective against a guy like Josh Allen and a team like that. So I think understanding the nuances of that and how that reflects in the stats, whether it's sack rate, pressure rate, things like that, is pretty important as well.
Do you originate your own power numbers?
So I do not, and I think that that's a little bit contrarian in the handicapping space overall. I know that that's a big part of most handicappers' process, but generally, I think that it is a great idea, but it's not something that I've been able to do successfully to this point, admittedly. But I think that finding edges on a matchup perspective has been kind of my go-to otherwise.
Okay. Now, I'm not saying it's bad. I know a lot of people who do not originate their own power ratings or don't or use it kind of loosely. But my secondary question would be, and matchup base is probably your answer, and it's a good answer. But for other people out there listening and watching and stuff like that, how do you know that you have value in a point spread? Without some sort of barometers or parameters in there? How do you know that if you like San Francisco -4 against the Rams, that in reality you should be only laying number one, 1 point or 2 points, that kind of scenario?
Right. And I think quantifying it is something that has been, I would guess, I would say a part of my journey to this point, and something that I'm trying to get better at. But just in general, like I think that, the question that you're asking is like, how do you know that a bad team, who we call as bad, is actually bad and like a good team is good? But then how do you find value in that specifically? I think that there's, like you said, matchup based, I think is important because so like a good team can be good because of their passing game, but also have no running game, or be bad because of their secondary is horrible, but be playing against, Colt McCoy. So, contextualizing why a team is good or bad with some of the stats that I talked about above, and then focusing on why that edge might not be reflected in the market, I think provides a little bit of value specifically. Beyond that, also, I think that getting certain plays around key numbers is obviously important. Understanding when that matters, in the NFL is also key. So again, quantifying it is not necessarily been my forte to date, but I think that there are still edges. Just trying to find
Yeah.
specific matchup edges that aren't really commonly known. I guess like you can't just pull a matchup edge off of Twitter and be like, oh, this is what I'm gonna lay this side with, because it's already probably accounted for in the market. So trying to find things that aren't being talked about, that you don't believe are being accounted for in the market as well, is obviously twofold there.
Yeah, I think I would call it the Kansas City syndrome, because we've seen the last 2 years, once Kansas City goes on a roll, and we know they're streaky. Andy Reid gets very streaky in a very good way, that they start winning a whole bunch of games. But the casual bettor who keeps betting Kansas City because they're good lost money each of the last 2 years because they'd be favored by 9 and win by 7, favored by 7 and win by 4. So it's a point of where is the number too high? And it's one of the dilemmas that gamblers, like you and I, we have to face week in and week out. We like this team, but it's like going shopping to me, and buying a shirt. At what point do you like the shirt for $50, but you don't like the shirt for $100 kind of thing?
Yeah.
So
And
it's a balancing act.
100%. Generally, something I've noticed personally with myself is I generally, for better or worse, don't take that many big favorites or big underdogs. It's just one of those things where I've found more success personally handicapping teams that are tighter in the market and that I deem to be better than one another. But the spread is a lot closer. So for me, I think that's just easier to quantify, where my edge actually is there specifically.
Okay. So I will call this my first show of the summer. So people who know me know if I don't ask a question about special teams, that I probably get 33 demerits, because I always ask about special teams. And I've seen so many people out there when they do their analysis, even publications. I'm reading some publications in NCAA, and they don't talk a word about special teams. And games are won and lost by the foot of a kicker or a bat or a punt block or something like that. So I'm going to ask every guest. So Connor, how do you evaluate special teams now, and how would you evaluate it during the season?
Yeah, it's something that I probably don't account for enough, but it's something that obviously, I guess closer to the season, I generally like to take a look at. I think kickers are obviously very important. Instability at that position is massive and can, like you said, win or lose games. We've seen it happen plenty of times in the past. But beyond that, I think that there are certain units that, whether it be punt coverage in the past, kick coverage, which at this point, I don't think really matters a whole lot as much considering the new rules, paying attention to specific teams who were like significantly better or worse than others just based on their coaching. And so off the top of my head, I can't think of the exact coaches, but I do remember in past years looking at this being like, wow, this team has been top 5 in special teams coverage for the last, few years. And a lot of it has to do with coaching. So it's something that I usually revisit kind of like right before the year, but not something that I have right off the top.
Okay. You had a podcast recently, I think, discussing a pretty deep dive into coaching changes into 2023. And it's not easy, in my opinion, to accurately quantify the changes, maybe unless Urban Meyer is not your coach and you're bringing in a new coach. That's probably easy to quantify. The players are going to play much harder. But how did you approach that task prior to your podcast? And what did you learn in terms of evaluating the coaches, head coaches, whatever, offensive coordinators, defensive coordinators, and then being able to apply that to 2023?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is the difficulty, not only quantifying, but separating a coach's ability from the players that they're given. And I think that that's extremely tough in small samples because you have a guy like Jonathan Gannon who coached the Eagles where they had, loads of talent. And now he's the head coach of the Arizona Cardinals. So we really know if Jonathan Gannon's a good coach at this point. I'm not entirely sold, but I think that some other people are. But for me, there are some examples where I think it's very easy. And I'm very confident that, a certain coach is good because I think one of my favorite examples is Vic Fangio. When he came to Chicago in 2015, he was a defensive coordinator there. He inherited a Chicago team that was like bottom 3 in basically every defensive metric, added no one, and then went from being a bottom 3 defense to middle of the pack consistently for multiple years as a defensive coordinator. Now, obviously, he was not as successful as a head coach, but I think that balance is not always easy for every coach. We see multiple other coaches where they're good as an OC and then they become a head coach and they're not really able to have quite as big of an impact there. So a guy like Vic Fangio this year, I'm a little bit more bullish on because I've already seen him be like a talent elevator. Brian Dable, you mentioned him as well, like a guy that came in with such marginal talent. Now, I think the schedule probably played a little bit of a role as well, but he had marginal talent around him and they were able to squeak into the playoffs and win a game. So I think that I try and, separate it as much as possible, and it's not always easy. And another thing that I've been looking at with coaching changes is first-year offensive coordinators that don't necessarily have an offensive head coach to lean on their ability of. So there's a guy, so guys like Drew Petzing this year, is going to be an offensive coordinator with Arizona. Jonathan Gannon is a defensive head coach. So Drew Petzing is a first-year play caller, first-year offensive coordinator with no talent. Like, if Kyler Murray's out, like absolutely no talent on Arizona. So I think that it just creates further volatility and generally more downside in situations like that. So those are the things that I look at with coaching changes, but I'm interested to hear your take on it as well.
Yeah. I think those are great points. And Arizona in particular has a pretty young staff, and they're all going to be kind of learning on the fly. The one thing I would point out, and then people have heard me say this before, is that I reevaluate the coaches. I evaluate them now, just like you did, very thoroughly this spring. But I reevaluate them after the first 4 weeks because I could be missing something. The scheme change may have been positive. The scheme change may have been negative. And I cannot stand when new coaches have bye weeks late in the year because the season goes so fast for them. They're in a new role. They're doing so many different things. They're wearing a new hat. If they have a bye early in the year, then they have a chance to recalibrate, and then they can move forward in that way. So I pay attention to the schedule for the new coaches for sure, and I do a reevaluation period. I don't know if that's something you do as well.
That's not something that I've done particularly, but I did. That is a very interesting point. I like that as a potential topic there because certain coaches I think adjust and others don't. I mean, we've seen a guy like Nathaniel Hackett basically make no adjustments and they were just sunk. It's just it is what it is. Whereas I think a guy like Brian Dable was constantly adjusting throughout the year. I mean, with everything, and he's squeezed every edge I thought that they had possible. Last year.
One thing I'm wrestling with right now, because the NFL is a dynamic changing league, and we're looking at a situation where offense sells. So we have a situation where two new coaches in 2022 came into play, one in Tampa and one in New Orleans, and Dennis Allen in New Orleans, for example. And they were both defensive coordinators. They were both defensive coaches in an offensive-minded league. And in Tampa, they had Tom Brady, but their offense dropped about 10 points per game. It was a noticeable drop, even with pretty much the same offense, except for a badly distorted offensive line. They lost a bunch of people on the offensive line, which matters. But what's your take? Because I'm still working through this on defensive coaches now becoming head coaches in an offensive-minded league.
Generally, I don't like it just because given the current state of the league, offense is more important than defense in my mind. And I know that might pain you to hear because of some of our pre-show talks there about you being a defensive guy. But at this point, like a good offense is just in my mind so much more important. So like you kind of lose that without like a, next Shanahan or McVay or McDaniel, something like that at offensive coordinator. And I think kind of without that, like you're just putting your team almost at a disadvantage because we see coaches like offensive coaches significantly elevate offenses, which generally helps the whole team. Whereas defenses, there's few and far, at least there's a lot fewer examples in my mind of a coach really truly putting a footprint and making like elevating their talent there. I mentioned Vic Fangio, but like, again, I mean, he's one of the few examples that I have over, I don't know, last 5-6 years specifically, whereas offensively, I think that there's multiple. So maybe it's just there aren't as many good defensive coaches, but personally, it's something that I'm not quite as big of a fan of.
Yeah, and it's really, in this day and age, you need somebody who could really run your offense. And it'll be interesting to see, for example, the Todd Monken experiment that's going on in Baltimore, because I assume Harbaugh is going to seed everything offensively to him, and they're going to have a complete scheme change, and he can concentrate on the areas that he's better at, defense and special teams.
Yeah, that's going to be very interesting. I don't with Monken because obviously they're going from Greg Roman, who was very run heavy. They're running a bunch of read options, things like that. Lamar's already come out and said they're not going to be running as much. They're going to be passing more. We saw Monken with the Bucks pass the ball an insane amount, but he also was at Georgia for a little bit where they had a great running game. I'm excited because I just think that he's a coach that will mold and adapt to his personnel because it's like Georgia obviously had talent, but if you look at the skill players outside of, Brock Bowers, they weren't like they weren't a team with like first round caliber guys. Like, I mean, Stetson Bennett was like a whatever fourth round pick. And it isn't really all like he was good in college, but I don't know. It's one of those things where I think he's a guy who's able to mold to his talent. And so I think they're going to be more pass heavy, but I don't think it's going to be like a crazy new offense where it's just going to be like 5 wide and they're going to be Jameis Winston chucking it or anything. So I'm personally excited about the Ravens, but I don't know. I know it's a little bit granular in terms of team. Have you have any thoughts on them specifically?
I'm just fascinated with the whole dynamic. I'm on record as saying I think Lamar Jackson makes John Harbaugh a better coach because John Harbaugh would be my bottom 5 coaches. And I know that's an unpopular take, but down and distance for 15 years, he has not understood how to close out second and fourth quarters. He runs the same offense. When Lamar Jackson was out, he went for 2 to win games 3 times over 2 years, I believe it was, with his backup quarterback, as if that player could run just as well and make split decisions just as well as Lamar Jackson can. I think Lamar Jackson masked his deficiencies, and I think I'm excited to see whether Todd Monken makes it so that Harbaugh can go back to what he does best. I'm not a Harbaugh fan, but I am a Baltimore fan because they're a very complete team.
Yeah, I agree. It's also I think underrated right now that Lamar played in like a pro style offense at Louisville. I mean, like he was able to like run a regular pro offense. So just the fact that he was running in more of a, I don't want to say gimmicky, but like I would say more of a college kind of style offense in some senses the past few years doesn't mean that he's not able to run like a pro style offense, I think this year. So it's one of those things that I'm really excited. I just think Lamar is awesome. They added great weapons. Like their offense specifically, I think can make up for any defensive deficiencies that they might have.
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating watch. Week 1 lines, they've been out for, I don't know, some books a couple of months now. And it's, there's a whole strategy behind attacking them. Briefly, for me, when a team plays another team is as important or more important than exactly what's going on week 1. There were examples last year with Joe Burrow not playing in the whole summer. He had an operation. Matthew Stafford had an operation. Yet these teams were not priced correctly to me. Buffalo was live against the Rams. Pittsburgh was live against Cincinnati. Now we have some other week 1 lines that we want to deal with. Jordan Love's first game. The whole Indy hype again. Tennessee, everybody's kind of putting them under the radar. Who starts at San Francisco? Is it Brock Purdy? Is it Trey Lance? The Monday night extravaganza with you got Buffalo and the Jets. So I'm curious as to what your approach is to week 1 and how you attack it. Do you set lines beforehand? Give me kind of your overall feeling about how you attack week 1.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of examples just like right on the board here that I like to attack that I've already placed. So I think a bet against the Arizona Cardinals for me is something that was pretty easy. Like Washington, I laid 5.5 with them. I think we're looking at 6. In my mind, as the offseason progresses, as we continue to get more negative news, that just inevitably we're going to get more closing line value. I think there as we see news that either Colt McCoy or Clayton Tune is going to start at quarterback for them. And this Washington team, and if you look at these 2 teams early on, it's like week 1, I like to try and find teams that I'm excited about in my priors and then teams that I'm down on and then kind of like match them up there. And then if we get like a little bit added value here where it seems like in my mind, there's like a 99% chance that Kyler Murray will not play week 1, but in the market's mind, I don't know if that's entirely factored in at this point. So I think that's like things I try and look for, not only week 1, but like there's a couple of other weeks early on in the season. Cowboys laying 6.5 at Arizona in week 3 as well. So I know that those aren't necessarily high liquidity markets in terms of the look aheads, but for most bettors, I would say, and again, I don't want to generalize your audience. Maybe your audience is only professional bettors, but I would say for most bettors, they should have no problem across multiple books being able to get down what they want on some of the look aheads as well. So,
yeah, I think it's interesting. I think the point I would make here to piggyback on what you said is that it's good for us to come in with a game plan as to how we want to attack each team. basically what I'm hearing is your game plan is Arizona's not going to be ready week 1, week 2, whatever. So where the matchups are favorable in your eyes, you might be looking to fade Arizona. Whereas if Arizona played Washington in week 12, you may not want to play that same game. But because they're playing in week 1, because personally, I'm not high on Washington or low on Washington. They're just kind of a neutral team with their own issues at quarterback that we have absolutely no idea what's going on. But I'll piggyback your point a little bit in that Washington's defensive line is going to be a mismatch for whoever is under center for Arizona.
Yeah, no, that's very well said there specifically. And I think it's a great example though. So if you're not high on Washington, I think that there are other times early in the season to fade this Cardinals team. If you're higher on, then market the Cowboys. The Ravens play them in week 8. I think that's a little bit late specifically, but again, you're laying less than 7 at that point. If Kyler Murray is still not playing, which I think is very, very reasonable given his range of outcomes based on everything we've been hearing. I don't see this being less than 10 by the time we get there. So, like, I know you're playing a little bit of a game there, but I do think that finding ways to fade teams specifically that I don't think the market's fully accounting for early in the season can be really helpful. And I think beyond that too, finding other teams that are, I think, being overrated in the market a little bit early in the season can be also helpful outside of other reasons besides just like injury. So I think a team like the Patriots specifically are a team that I'm looking to fade early in the season before I think the market catches up with just how them not actually being as good as what they're suggesting right now.
Yeah, there are always some head scratching upsets week 1. Sometimes there's an overreaction after week 1, but there's also some favorites that if we had the crystal ball, if we had the time machine and we were in week 10, we would go back and say, how was that team favored in week 1? And our task is to find them before everybody else does. And maybe somebody laying 5.5, 6 shouldn't be favored. It goes with some of the homework we're doing. You mentioned New England. We spoke offline about perhaps highlighting one team in your 2023 preparation. And the team you're going to be talking about is fascinating, I think, on an absolute large number of levels. So I want to give you the floor, talk about the team you've targeted, and walk me through the process as to how you have arrived at your current opinion for this particular team.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about the New England Patriots a little bit, and you hit it on the head there with there being so many different layers of why this team is so interesting on so many different levels, because just going through the units here specifically, offensively, I think it's definitely reasonable to project a step forward for Mac Jones with Bill O'Brien and, getting rid of the whole Joe Judge, Matt Patricia experiment from last year. But that being said, the offensive line still projects to be middle of the road. Juju, Devontae Parker, and Kendrick Bourne as your 3 wide receiver sets does not excite me and does not, for me, that's a bottom tier wide receiving group. And beyond that, I think that the Bill O'Brien hire might be a little bit overrated compared to what everyone's been talking about in the media. And from a defensive standpoint, this is where I think the biggest edge comes into play here. You're looking at last year, them playing 8 games against essentially bottom 5 quality offensive play. In those games, they were absolutely elite, top 3 in basically every single metric. In every other game, which included a lot of games against very good teams, the Bills, Chiefs, Bengals, things like that, they were essentially bottom 5 in most other metrics. And while that obviously makes sense, they're bad against bad teams, good against good teams. This schedule they're playing this year is absolutely insane. They're literally starting with 4 playoff teams right off the bat, including the Eagles, the Cowboys, the Jets, the Dolphins, or I guess fringe playoff teams. Don't think we can anoint the Jets or Dolphins quite a playoff team at this point. But I think the point is that their schedule, no matter how you kind of shake it, whether it's projected win totals, our friend at 44 Sharp Clark does a good job of looking at range of outcomes for schedule, like strength of schedule as well. Their lowest projected outcome of strength of schedule is like harder than the worst, like best range of outcomes. So it's like they're so far ahead of everyone else in terms of what their strength of schedule is going to be that even with a team that is expected to be that would be awesome, I think they'd have a tough time winning 8-9 games. But there's so many holes on this roster, whether it's coaching, whether it's defense that I think is a little bit overrated, whether it's offense that needs to take a step up. And if they don't, they're in big trouble. Like there's so many factors that need to go right for them to even be flirting with that 8-9 win range. Whereas if any of those go wrong, there's plenty of paths to, 5-6 wins here for this Patriots team. So that's kind of how I've broken it down here. And there's a couple other metrics that I have as well, but I'm curious your take on the Pats, because I think that my main argument against it is like Bill Belichick is just the best coach of all time, and he figures out a way to get through this.
Okay, well, I did come into this wanting to play devil's advocate, but before I do that, I want to endorse some of the points you made. First of all, I was surprised that they drafted 12 players and didn't trade up in the draft. I've produced 43 draft reports. I do schedule analysis year after year after year. So one thing stands true. It's not just that New England's schedule is difficult, especially early. It's more difficult than they are used to. It's a real bump up in difficulty from 2021 and 2022 in terms of what they're facing. So I endorse that point. And the surprising thing with the draft is that I think Belichick's here to stay. He's roughly 70, 71 years old, right in that range. Let me say, for personal sake, 70 years young. For those of us who have been doing this for a long time. And I think this draft signals that he wants to see this through. But he's also taken developmental offensive linemen, and he's taken developmental wide receivers and so on. And that doesn't always translate to wins right away. My question to you right away is, how do you equate, what value do you put on McCourty's retirement? Do you think that'll have effect? Belichick, pride and joy is defensive secondary, and somehow they'll probably find a way. But did you factor in the fact that McCourty retired?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, if we're looking at their projected defensive starting lineup right here, like Christian Gonzalez is slated to probably start week 1, as you mentioned, as their top draft pick. I mean, looking at Jonathan Jones, Jalen Mills graded as 115th out of 118 corners according to PFF last year. I think it's also clear. I think PFF does some things very well, some things not as well. But I think that generally using them for positions that are tough to quantify outside of, generally just watching the snaps is always useful to, I think, have as a crutch there specifically. But yeah, their linebackers are slow. They've talked about playing lighter personnel, but against certain opponents, I think that could be a mistake. Like week 1 against the Eagles, if you try and play lighter personnel against the Eagles, you're going to get absolutely thrashed on the ground. And so I don't know. I mean, I think that maybe they figure it out here, but specifically, this defense already was overrated. Now with McCourty's retirement, I think that you're looking at a team that's not really set up for success here defensively.
Now we're looking across the board pretty much at a 7.5 win total. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah. 7.5, a little bit of juice on the under.
Okay. So that means for you to win, they have to go 7-10 or less.
Yep.
By my astute mathematical formula for 17 games. Actually, I pride myself on my math, but I just want to put it out there. 7-10. And it's been a long time since Bill Belichick coach team has lost 10 games. So I'm looking at their schedule too right now. And you mentioned what's the one thing that could happen is that he has a coaching advantage. So I would say he has a coaching advantage against Dennis Allen and New Orleans, and the game is at home, obviously. It was a weird game against Las Vegas last year. And now Jacoby Myers, who was the victim of that crazy lateral passes, switched teams, and he's on. I don't even know where to go with that game, and the fact that it's probably a primetime game and everything. But that'll be an interesting game. They probably they have Washington at home. They have Indianapolis at home. The Chargers are, I think, they get outcoached from time to time. People would say that Staley, this is a do or die year for them. So there are winnable games on their schedule, but it is a brutal schedule. So the preparation period for Belichick has always kind of been an advantage. Special teams died last year, and he prides himself on special teams. I will say this as devil's advocate. He's going to have a new punter. He's going to have a new kicker, place kicker. And I think he's even changed his long snapper. He personally went out on at least 15 visits during draft season to test out people who would play on special teams. I think you'll see improved special teams. And the only other devil's advocate point I would make is that I like their quarterback. I don't think he's a top 10 quarterback. I don't think he's a bottom 10 quarterback. I think he is what he is when he was drafted, better than people's perceptions and good enough to win a game if the defense doesn't screw it up.
Yeah, I think that's very fair on Mac Jones because he's definitely not as bad as we saw last year. Then that's for sure. But I just don't know how much better he is and like what the upside is with like kind of their receiving core here because they don't have a true number one. I mean, Juju can be a slot guy, you know, like, but Tyquan Thornton, he's not really a number one receiver. He's kind of like a, gimmicky guy, or maybe you can use him like a stretch outside receiver. Like there's just not a whole lot of scenarios where I'm like, okay, this passing game is going to be awesome. I think the really only scenario where I see this offense being good is like if they are dominant on the offensive line unexpectedly and their running game is going well and they're able to, run a little more play action, run, get some of the other guys into space. But again, that involves so much more like a next step for the offensive line or a next step for the coaching and Mac Jones playing better than he did last year. So there's just so many ifs with projecting this team to be good that it's something that I just continue to feel better and better about on the under of 7.5 wins over the course of the season. That being said, I think, like you said, there are a couple winnable games here. Washington, Indianapolis, I would say are more than winnable, but for the majority of their games, they're at a pretty significant talent deficit in my mind. So it really has to be on their defense being elite against good opponents, or their offense taking like a significant step forward.
It's kind of interesting because I'm not bullish on New England, but I'm not sure I would be willing to say as an under better, and I am a poster child for betting under season wins. I don't think I'm willing at this point to pull the trigger that a Bill Belichick coach team would have a 10-loss season. But then again, if we take the nameplates off and we say this isn't New England, you have this fantastic coach, you have this team, you have this schedule, and nobody knew it was New England, you probably say that, wait a second, this is a fourth place team in that division. The Jets have drafted so well the last 2 years. We know that Buffalo has a very deep roster, and Miami's with Vic Fangio. You mentioned Vic Fangio, and he is an enormous addition to a team that needs it because they've drafted, talking about New England, they drafted 12 players in 2023. Miami's drafted 8 players the last 2 years combined. So we're not talking about forward thinking. We're not talking about planning for 2024. And today, Tyreek Hill got in a little bit of hot water or trouble and stuff like that. It's kind of been on my news feed. So in the NFL, you're one news feed away from losing somebody. But I understand where you're going from New England. I think it's an interesting case study, and I think see if you agree with me on this, that maybe part of your game plan is because it's New England, you might be able to find value going against them various times during the season.
Yeah, I mean, right off the bat from week one, I think that the Eagles against them in week one, they're laying, I believe it's 4.5, depending on the shop. I really like the Eagles, even on the road against New England. I know that Bill Belichick with some prep is generally something that, is tough to avoid, but also looking at Miami is pick 'em right now, week 2 against them on Caesars as well, which I really like Miami in that spot. So I think those 2 weeks early on fading them, I'll be playing both of those. So,
do you project them 4th in the division?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the Jets are a little bit more volatile than most people are projecting specifically, but they just have so much more talent defensively and offensively. I think that even if Aaron Rodgers is not as good as we've seen, or if things break down, I think that the defense is enough to carry them to be better than New England.
Yeah. If you have the crystal ball and you could tell me exactly how many games Tua plays this year, then I'll know where to swap Miami. That's one team I'm going to try to avoid personally, but we know what we're getting into with New England. It's just a case of assessing whether or not that talent, and I agree with you as far as the wide receiver. I mean, they just haven't got it right at wide receiver. And so we've got to figure that part out. I could go on and on and on, but I kept you for a long time. Any final thoughts before we kind of close this up?
Uh, Not too much for me. I did have a question for you specifically. I saw you tweeted out about your preview guide that's coming up. What goes into that, or like what's in that specifically? Because I might have to get myself a copy.
Well, it's 2 pages per team, 64 pages overall. And it's a labor of love for me. I've been doing it for 40 years. And it basically talks about, and anybody, by the way, can get a free team preview. I give out a team for anybody who asked, just direct message me. And it talks about my observations, key stats, key takeaways from last year, how they did in free agency, what the schedule looks like, what I thought they should do in the draft. I don't just analyze the draft and each player, but I talk about what I would have done and what areas they left uncovered. And at the end of the whole thing, I talk about, okay, what's their prognosis right now? How do I feel about them right now? Are they ready to start the season? Are they not? I analyze the coaching changes. 2 pages is a lot of stuff, but it's only scratches the surface. But there's a lot of detail there, and it's meant to help others, but it also helps me focus so that when I'm done on May 25th or whatever with this report, I'm ready to go for the NFL. And basically, that's what it is.
Love it. Awesome.
There's been a couple questions in the chat, and I want specifically to let you know that people want to know about the podcast that you've done, and specifically about the podcast where you talk about the coaches. So after the show, you may want to tweet it out again, your coaches, because you've gotten some interest in that, because you did a deep dive on that and other topics. So people are certainly going to be interested in your work. So talk a little bit about what you've done and what you plan to do the rest of this summer.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ron. So you can my podcast I do with Sharp Clark and Ryan Noonan every week. It's called Move the Line Podcast. I believe that they were asking about the coaching changes. That was a couple weeks ago, I think, at this point, but it'll be labeled coaching changes. So if you just go to the feed, Move the Line, you can find that there. It's free. We have a bunch of tools over at 4for4.com. It's where you can find all the rest of my written work, and you can follow me on Twitter at Connor Allen NFL, writing about trying to make everyone smarter, win more money together, and beat the betting markets. So that's, I guess, my basic spiel.
I'm always interested in what you and others have out there. Networking is good. I applaud everybody who does writing or tries writing. I applaud everybody who listens to, I thank everybody who listens to these podcasts and networks with me and with Connor and so on. Connor, thanks so much for being on this particular show. Hopefully we'll connect again later down the road as we get closer to the season and during the season. And hopefully I'll be back as well to provide some more content as we go through. First day of summer, but it's never too early to talk about football. Thanks again, Connor, and thanks for everybody who watched and listened to the show, and we'll see you down the road.